There are moments that feel like the faint click of a camera shutter, capturing an image you won't get to see until much later. You live through them, unaware of their weight, and only in the quiet of the darkroom, long after the light has faded, do you watch the truth of them develop. For me, that moment arrived not with a click, but with the subtle shift of water in a shallow plastic tray. It was the moment the story I was telling the world was eclipsed by the one that was silently unfolding in the amber glow of my own small, secluded universe. The story he was supposed to be writing about me became insignificant. The real story was the one he was becoming a part of, the one he was inadvertently helping me to finally tell. He was there, in my darkroom, a place I considered more private than my own bedroom. Liam. He was supposed to be an observer, a chronicler, the dispassionate voice that would translate my quiet, grayscale world for a glossy magazine audience. He had a reporter's practiced ease, a way of leaning into your space that felt both predatory and inviting, a professional tool he wielded with the same unconscious skill I used to adjust my aperture. But in the hushed, chemical-scented air of that room, the tools of his trade had been left by the door. There was no notepad, no digital recorder, just him, a silhouette against the single safe light, watching me. I was coaxing an image from a blank sheet of photographic paper, my fingers submerged in the developer. It was a photograph of an old, abandoned house on the edge of my hometown, its windows like vacant eyes. It was part of the collection he was here to write about, my series on architectural ghosts and the economic decay that had hollowed out the place where I grew up. We had been talking for hours, but the conversation had long since drifted from the prescribed topics of my art, my process, my intent. It had meandered into the quiet backroads of memory and confession, the kinds of conversations that only seem possible after midnight, when the rest of the world has gone to sleep and the pretense of who you're supposed to be can finally be laid to rest. He stood beside me, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his arm, a stark contrast to the cool, damp air. He watched the image slowly materialize in the tray, a ghost emerging from the white void. The skeletal branches of a winter tree, the peeling paint on the porch, the deep, impenetrable black of a doorway. He made a soft sound, a note of wonder that was entirely genuine, stripped of his usual journalistic polish. It was the sound of someone seeing, not just looking. And then he moved. It was a small, almost imperceptible motion. His hand, which had been resting on the edge of the workbench, lowered. His fingers dipped into the cool liquid of the tray, next to mine. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to the established boundaries of our professional relationship, that for a split second, my mind refused to process it. Then I felt it, the brush of his skin against my own. It wasn't a grab, or a hold, or anything definitive. It was a fleeting, water-cushioned contact, the side of his index finger against the side of mine. A current, separate from the chemical reactions in the tray, passed between us. It was a spark in the dark, a question asked without words. In that single, submerged touch, the entire architecture of our interactions collapsed. He was no longer the reporter. I was no longer the subject. We were just two people, standing in the dark, watching a ghost emerge, suddenly aware of the living, breathing reality of each other. I remember thinking, with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that this was it. This was the moment the real story began. The story he would never write. The story I was finally, desperately, beginning to live. Our beginning was thoroughly, almost painfully, professional. It started with an email from a publication I respected, a magazine known for its long-form cultural pieces. The email mentioned a reporter by the name of Liam Carter, who had apparently seen my work in a small gallery show and had pitched a feature on me and my series. The hollow places my initial reaction was a complicated knot of pride and dread. The pride was a faint, sun-warmed surface, the validation that my years of solitary work, of driving down desolate roads with my heavy medium-format camera, had finally resonated with someone. The dread, however, was a deep, cold ocean. My work was born from a place of profound privacy, a visual language I had developed to speak about things I couldn't otherwise articulate. The idea of translating it back into words, especially for a stranger, felt like a betrayal of its very essence. I almost said no. I typed out 3 different polite refusals, my finger hovering over the send button each time. I am a photographer, not a speaker. I work in light and shadow, not sentences. My process is one of quiet observation, and the thought of being observed myself was deeply unsettling. I used my camera as a shield, a way to be present in the world without being fully a part of it. It placed a barrier of glass and metal between me and everything else, allowing me to look, to frame, to capture, without being fully seen. An interview, especially with a reporter known for his insightful, personal profiles, would shatter that barrier. It felt like volunteering for an emotional excavation. But something in his initial email, a short, personal note appended to the official request from his editor, gave me pause. He wrote, "Your photos don't feel like they're about buildings. They feel like they're about the silence left inside them. I'd like to understand that silence." That one sentence snagged me. He wasn't interested in the technical aspects or the novelty of my subject matter. He was interested in the feeling. He had looked at my images of collapsing barns and empty storefronts and heard the quiet. He had seen the soul of the work. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Our first meeting was at a sterile coffee shop halfway between his office and my apartment. He was exactly as I had pictured him from his author photo, effortlessly charming, with a restless energy that seemed barely contained by his chair. He had a smile that was quick and bright, but I noticed, with the trained eye of someone who looks for the details in the shadows, that it didn't always quite reach his eyes. There was a watchfulness to him, a sense that he was constantly gathering information, cataloging gestures, filing away inflections. He was a professional observer, just like me, but his medium was people. I was, by contrast, a study in guardedness. I gave him the answers I had prepared, the safe, art school-approved explanations of my project. I talked about light theory and the beauty of decay and the socioeconomic factors that led to the decline of my hometown. I was building a wall of words, brick by professional brick, and I could see the subtle frustration flickering in his gaze. He wanted the silence, and I was giving him noise. I found myself cataloging him in return. The way he'd run a hand through his already messy hair when he was thinking. The way he tapped his pen against his notepad, a rhythmic, impatient beat. The way his focus would sharpen when I accidentally let a personal detail slip, like a predator catching a scent on the wind. And beneath it all, there was an undeniable, deeply inconvenient pull. A part of me, the part that had spent years in lonely observation, was drawn to his vitality, his easy engagement with the world. I had developed a quiet, solitary affection for men like him from a safe distance, the kind of men who moved through life with a confidence I could only ever photograph. I'd learned early to classify that feeling as admiration, to file it away in a drawer labeled untenable, and lock it. It was a familiar ache, a low hum of longing that I had long ago accepted as a permanent part of my internal landscape. With Liam, that hum was louder, more insistent. I found myself watching the way his lips formed words, the crinkle of his eyes when he laughed at one of my dry, unintentional jokes. I was studying him with an intensity that had nothing to do with the interview, and I buried the resulting data deep, where it couldn't be seen. I told myself it was professional curiosity, a photographer studying his subject. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. He mentioned a girlfriend, then corrected himself. Ex-girlfriend, I guess. It's recent, he said it with a casual shrug. But there was a flicker of something else there, not heartbreak, but a kind of weary resignation, like a traveler who finds himself on a longer, more complicated road than he had anticipated. His life, as he sketched it out, was full of people, deadlines, events, a constant stream of external stimuli. It was the complete opposite of my own, which was defined by long stretches of solitude, by the patient waiting for the right light, by the slow, meditative process of the darkroom. We were 2 different species of animal, one built for the bustling herd, the other for the quiet forest. And yet, in that first meeting, I sensed a shared loneliness, a different texture of the same fundamental quiet he had seen in my photographs. His was a loneliness found in a crowd. Mine was a loneliness found in empty rooms. I didn't know it then, but it was this shared, unacknowledged solitude that would become the foundation for everything that followed. The interviews were not going well. We had met 3 more times, and each session felt like a polite, fruitless dance. I would offer him carefully curated anecdotes about my childhood, about the technical challenges of shooting on film, and he would dutifully jot them down, his questions becoming more pointed, more desperate, as he tried to dig beneath the polished surface I was presenting. I could feel his frustration mounting. He was a storyteller, and I was giving him nothing but footnotes. The article was due, his editor was getting impatient, and I, his subject, remained an enigma, a locked room. The shift came on a Tuesday night, a miserable, rain-slicked evening that seemed to mirror my own internal state. We were in my apartment, the pretense of a formal interview location long abandoned. He had brought Chinese food, a peace offering of sorts. We ate in a tense silence, the only sound the drumming of rain against the window pane. He had his notepad out, but he hadn't written a single word. Finally, he set his chopsticks down with a clatter and let out a long, ragged sigh. He looked defeated. "It's not working, is it?" he said, his voice quiet. He wasn't looking at me, but at the skyline, a blurry watercolor of gray and neon through the wet glass. I didn't pretend not to understand. "I'm not very good at this." "No, it's not you. It's me," he said, and he finally turned to look at me. The professional mask was gone. In its place was a raw, unvarnished exhaustion. I'm pushing for a story, an angle, a neat little narrative hook. The artist who finds beauty in ruin, it's such bullshit. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I was coming to recognize as a tell for his anxiety. "The truth is," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, "I spend all day asking people for their truth, and I don't even know what mine is anymore." The confession hung in the air between us, fragile and real. He started talking, not as a reporter, but as a man. He talked about his breakup, not with the sorrow of a lost love, but with the hollow confusion of someone who realized he'd been playing a part he didn't know the lines to. He talked about his job, the endless cycle of finding a person, packaging their life into a consumable story, and moving on to the next. He described a profound sense of dislocation, a feeling like a ghost in his own life, merely observing the motions without truly feeling them. "Every story I write, I'm looking for something real," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Something that feels solid. And I look at your photographs, and I feel it. It's in there. But when I ask you about it, you give me art speak. It's like you're protecting it." He was right. I was. That silence he admired in my work was my own. It was the quiet of a boy who grew up feeling out of place, the quiet of a man who learned to love from a distance, the quiet of a life lived behind a lens. To explain it would be to expose the very core of myself, a core I had spent a lifetime protecting. But in his vulnerability, I saw a mirror. His loneliness in a crowd was the twin to my loneliness in empty spaces. He had, in his moment of professional crisis, offered me a piece of his own truth. It was an unexpected, disarming gift. And so, I made a choice. I stood up. "The story isn't in the answers I give you," I said, my voice unsteady. "It's not in the words. It's in the process." I gestured for him to follow me. "Come on. I'll show you." I led him down the short hallway to the smallest room in my apartment, a converted closet that smelled of fixer and stop bath. I flipped on the amber safe light, casting the room in a warm, monastic glow. It was my sanctuary, the place where the outside world fell away and all that mattered was light, shadow, and time. I had never willingly brought anyone in here before. It felt like opening a door to my own soul. "This is where the silence happens," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't speak. He just stood in the doorway, taking it all in. The enlarger standing like a sentinel, the trays lined up like offerings, the clothespins holding drying negatives that looked like captured memories. He had crossed a threshold, not just into a room, but into my world. The professional distance had collapsed, and in its place, a fragile, unspoken intimacy had begun to form. The interview was over. Something else was just beginning. The nature of our meetings transformed after that night. The word interview was retired, replaced by a comfortable, unspoken arrangement. Liam would text me, usually late in the evening, "Darkroom tonight," or "Feel like takeout and staring at contact sheets?" The pretense was always the work, the article. He was, in theory, engaging in a kind of long-form immersive journalism, trying to absorb my world by osmosis. But the notebook rarely made an appearance anymore. The digital recorder stayed in his bag. The questions he asked were no longer about my artistic intent, but about my day, about the music I was listening to, about whether I preferred steamed or fried dumplings. The story he was supposed to be writing had become a convenient fiction, a shared alibi for the time we were beginning to spend together. Our evenings developed a rhythm, a ritual. They often started in the darkroom, the amber light creating a bubble of intimacy around us. I would work, and he would watch, learning the patient alchemy of the process. He learned the smell of the developer, the sharp tang of the stop bath. He learned to read the ghostly images on the negatives. He was a quiet, attentive student. But the darkroom was my space of focus, of work. The real shift happened when we would emerge, blinking, into the normal light of my apartment, our eyes adjusting, the spell of the amber room broken. We would be tired, the hour always later than we intended, and we would migrate to the living room. The couch became our new territory, a landscape where the unspoken rules were being rewritten, night by night. It started innocently enough. One night, after a particularly long session developing prints, he leaned his head back, closed his eyes, and said, "God, I'm exhausted. Mind if I just crash here for a minute?" I had murmured that it was fine, my heart giving a nervous, unexpected lurch. I had retreated to the kitchen to busy myself making tea, hyper-aware of his presence, of his stillness in the other room. When I returned, he was asleep, his face softer, younger, the reporter's watchfulness gone. I hesitated, then draped a throw blanket over him, my fingers brushing his shoulder. The contact was brief, accidental, but it felt like a transgression. That night established a precedent. The couch became his default place of rest. A week later, he didn't even ask. He just sank into the cushions with a weary groan, pulling the throw blanket over himself like it was his own. The ritual began to escalate in small, almost imperceptible increments. First, it was just him sleeping on the couch while I worked at my desk a few feet away. Then, one night, I was tired too. I sat on the far end of the couch, reading a book, the length of 3 cushions separating us. The silence was comfortable, a shared domesticity that felt both wonderful and deeply dangerous. My internal monologue during these evenings was a relentless, exhausting analysis. I was a seismograph, registering every tiny tremor of our interactions. When he shifted closer, was it an unconscious search for warmth or a deliberate move? When his foot brushed against mine, was it an accident of proximity or a tentative question? I was developing 100 different narratives in my head, each one a different possible interpretation of the evidence. I was terrified of choosing the wrong one, of overexposing the moment and bleaching it of its truth, or of underexposing it and missing the image altogether. This new, fragile ecosystem we were building was so precious to me, this unexpected friendship that was shaded with something more. The fear of naming that something more and watching it crumble to dust was immense. So I said nothing. I just observed, and I hoped. The plausible deniability of it all was his shield and my torture. He was a man going through a difficult time. His life was in flux after a breakup. He was working a stressful job. He was tired. He needed a quiet place to decompress. He needed a friend. Any of his actions, taken individually, could be explained away by these facts. It was only in their accumulation, in the steady, nightly progression towards greater intimacy, that a different picture began to emerge. A picture I was almost too afraid to look at directly. "Stay," he asked one night, his voice thick with sleep. He had been asleep for an hour, and I had been about to get up and go to my own bed. My movement had stirred him. "Just for a bit. Don't want to be by myself." The request was so simple, so vulnerable. It sliced through my layers of analysis. It wasn't about the couch or the blanket. It was about presence. He wanted me to be there. So I stayed. I sat on the floor beside the couch, my back against it, until my own head grew heavy and I drifted off, my shoulder resting against the cushion just inches from his hand. The final layer of the ritual fell into place a few nights after that. We were watching some old movie, the volume low. He had stretched out, his head on the armrest. I was sitting at the other end. Midway through the film, he shifted, moving down the couch, and rested his head in my lap. Just like that. No preamble. No negotiation. One moment we were separated by a yard of fabric. The next, the weight of his head was a warm, solid reality on my thighs. My entire body went rigid. I stopped breathing. I stared straight ahead at the television, not seeing it, every nerve ending firing. He let out a soft sigh, a sound of pure contentment, and seemed to fall asleep almost instantly. My hand, which had been resting on my knee, was frozen in place. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly, carefully, lowered it to his shoulder. And then, feeling bolder than I had ever felt in my life, I let my fingers drift into his hair. It was soft. He didn't stir. The anxiety in my chest slowly uncoiled, replaced by a feeling so profound and peaceful it almost made me want to weep. It was a dangerous, beautiful, terrifying comfort. This was our ritual now. This was the new silence we shared, and I had no idea where it was leading. The night it happened, the air itself felt different. A storm had been threatening all day, and by evening, the sky had broken open. The sound of the rain was a constant, percussive drumming against the windows, isolating my apartment from the rest of the world, turning it into an arc adrift on a dark, rushing sea. Liam had shown up early, soaked to the skin, with a sheepish grin and a bag containing 2 cartons of soup. He didn't offer an excuse for his presence. He no longer needed one. He was just here. It was where he came now, when the world outside became too loud or too lonely. We ate, and we talked, but the conversation was more fragmented than usual. We were both distracted by the symphony of the storm, by a tension that had been building between us for weeks, a low hum of electricity that was now, thanks to the weather, crackling audibly in the air. We ended up on the couch, falling into our established ritual. He stretched out, and without a word, I shifted so he could rest his head in my lap. It was a familiar configuration, the weight of him a comforting, grounding presence. But tonight, it felt different. Charged. The casual, plausible deniability that had always been our safety net had begun to feel thin, transparent. The movie we put on was just background noise, a flickering series of images that neither of us was watching. I was acutely aware of everything else. The scent of rain on his jacket, still drying by the door. The faint, clean smell of his shampoo. The almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. My hand was in its usual place, resting on his shoulder, but I didn't dare move it to his hair. Tonight, that small gesture felt like it would be a confession, a step too far. The movie ended. The credits rolled in silence. The rain had softened to a steady, rhythmic hiss. The room was dark, save for the cool, blue-white light of the television screen and the occasional flash of distant lightning that momentarily illuminated the lines of his face. He hadn't fallen asleep. I knew because his breathing wasn't deep enough, and I could feel a subtle tension in the muscles of his neck. The silence stretched, no longer comfortable, but filled with a question that was growing louder and louder in my own mind. His hand, which had been resting on his stomach, moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion. He reached up and covered my hand, the one on his shoulder. His fingers laced through mine. My heart, which had been beating a steady, anxious rhythm, suddenly hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was new. This was not part of the ritual. This was a deviation from the script. This was a clear, unambiguous gesture, and it terrified me as much as it thrilled me. We stayed like that for a long time, hands intertwined, the silence deepening, becoming a vessel for everything we hadn't said. The weight of his head in my lap, the warmth of his hand holding mine. It was an answer. It had to be. but I was too afraid to ask the question. Then, his voice, a low whisper that was almost lost in the sound of the rain. Ethan, my own voice felt trapped in my throat. I managed a sound, a faint hum of acknowledgement. He shifted slightly, turning his head so he could look up at me. In the dim, flickering light, his eyes were dark, serious, stripped of all artifice. The reporter was gone. The charming, confident man was gone. There was only Liam, looking at me with a vulnerability that mirrored my own. "Can I ask you something that's not for the article?" he whispered. The phrase was a ghost of our old dynamic, a relic from a time that now felt a lifetime away. A small, hysterical laugh almost escaped me. Nothing had been for the article for weeks. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, a single, jerky motion. He held my gaze. His thumb stroked the back of my hand, a slow, soothing rhythm. The seconds stretched into an eternity. I could feel my own story, my own carefully constructed life of solitude and observation, balancing on the knife's edge of this single moment. "Would it be okay," he said, his voice barely audible, each word chosen with infinite care, "if I kissed you?" The question was not a demand. It was not a move in a game. It was an offering. It was a request for permission. It was the most honest, vulnerable thing anyone had ever said to me. All the noise in my head, the analysis, the fear, the second-guessing, went completely silent. The relentless internal monologue that had narrated my entire life finally, blessedly, stopped. There was only his question, hanging in the quiet room, and the simple, overwhelming truth of my own desire. I didn't answer with a word. I didn't trust myself to speak. I simply leaned down, closing the small distance between us. The last thing I saw before my eyes closed was the look of profound, heart-stopping relief that washed over his face. And then his lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, movie screen kiss. It was hesitant. It was soft. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the taste of rain and salt and a quiet, desperate, mutual recognition. It was the moment the ghost in the photograph became a living, breathing thing. It was the end of the silence. I woke to the pale, gray light of morning and the unsettling feeling of emptiness. The space beside me on the couch was cold. The throw blanket was folded neatly on the armrest. For a disoriented moment, I wondered if I had dreamed it all. The storm, the confession in his eyes, the impossible, tender reality of his kiss. But the scent of rain and his shampoo lingered in the air, a phantom presence, and the ghost of his touch was still a live current on my skin. He was gone. I sat up, my body stiff from sleeping on the couch. My heart, which had felt so full and peaceful when I had finally drifted to sleep with his head on my chest, was now a tight, anxious knot. I reached for my phone on the coffee table, my hand trembling slightly. There was a single new message. From Liam. Sent at 5:17 a.m. My breath caught. I opened it, my thumb hovering over the screen. "Sorry, had to run for an early meeting. Talk later." That was it. For perfunctory words and a vague, non-committal promise. Talk later, the casual brevity of it was like a slap. It was the kind of text you send to an acquaintance, not to someone you had shared a moment of profound, world-altering intimacy with just hours before. The warmth of the previous night instantly began to recede, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. The careful architecture of hope I had constructed in the wake of his kiss began to tremble, its foundations suddenly seeming to be made of sand. Later never came. I waited all day, my phone a lead weight in my pocket. Every notification, every buzz, sent a jolt of panicked hope through me, only to be followed by a wave of disappointment. I reread his text a dozen times, then 100, trying to decipher it, to find a hidden meaning, a trace of the man who had asked permission to kiss me. But there was nothing. It was a blank wall. By evening, a sick, heavy certainty had settled in my stomach. He was avoiding me. I tried calling him. It went straight to voicemail, his cheerful, professional recording a cruel parody of the man I thought I knew. I didn't leave a message. What would I say? "Hi, it's Ethan. Just calling to see if the kiss that I think might have reoriented my entire universe meant anything to you at all." The thought was mortifying. I felt foolish, exposed. The quiet observer, the man who prided himself on his ability to see, had been completely blind. I had misinterpreted everything. I had built a fantasy out of a lonely man's need for temporary comfort. I was a convenient harbor in his storm, and now that the storm had passed, he had set sail without a backward glance. The pain of it was a physical thing, a hollow ache in my chest. It was the old, familiar loneliness, but this time it was sharper, laced with the poison of a hope that had been allowed to bloom, only to be trampled. 3 days later, an email arrived. The subject line was article draft. My blood ran cold. It was from Liam. It was brisk, professional, clinical. Ethan, it began, here's a draft of the piece. I think I have everything I need, but let me know if there are any factual inaccuracies. My editor is pleased, and we're planning to run it in the next issue. Thank you again for your time and access. It was a pleasure working with you. Best, Liam. A pleasure working with you. The words were a gut punch. He had sealed us back into our original boxes. He was the reporter. I was the subject. The darkroom, the couch, the late-night talks, the rain, the kiss. It was all being erased, redacted from the official record. I couldn't bring myself to open the attached document. I couldn't bear to see my own life, our shared intimacy, packaged and polished into a consumable story by the man who had just shattered it. The silence from him was no longer a space of possibility. It was a weapon. It was a denial. For another day, I did nothing. I let the anger and hurt fester. I walked through my apartment, and every surface seemed to mock me. The couch, the darkroom door, the window he had looked through. They were all pieces of a crime scene, evidence of a hope that had been murdered. And then, the anger began to curdle into a different kind of resolve. I wasn't just hurt. I was angry at him, but I was also angry at myself. I had spent my entire life hiding behind a lens, curating my own silence. He had invited me out of it, and I had come. I would not let him be the one to shove me back into the dark. He had asked me for my truth, over and over. Now, I was going to give it to him. The real truth. Not the story of my photographs, but the story of us. I didn't call. I didn't email. I put on my jacket, walked out of my apartment, and took the subway to the address of his office, the one listed on his business card. I stood on the street, staring up at the gleaming glass tower, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I had no plan, no prepared speech. I was armed with nothing but the raw, undeniable truth of what had happened between us. He had come into my world, my quiet, carefully ordered space. Now, I was entering his. The interview was finally about to get real. I found him in the chaotic, open-plan office of the magazine, a hive of ringing phones and clattering keyboards. He was standing by a large window, talking to a colleague, a coffee cup in his hand. He looked exactly like the man I had first met, confident, at ease, a master of his environment. He laughed at something his colleague said, and the sound, which I had once found so charming, now grated on me. He hadn't seen me. I walked towards him, my steps feeling unnaturally loud in my own ears. I was a ghost from another world, a grayscale figure stepping into his world of color and noise. Liam, I said. My voice was low, but it cut through the office chatter. He turned. The smile vanished from his face as if it had been wiped clean. He saw me, and in his eyes, I saw a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. He quickly excused himself from his colleague, his movements jerky and unnatural, and guided me by the elbow to a small, empty conference room. The door clicked shut behind us, and the noise of the office was instantly muted. We were in another bubble, but this one was not safe or intimate. It was a vacuum. He wouldn't look at me. He busied himself with adjusting the blinds, straightening a stack of papers on the table, anything to avoid my gaze. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. You can't be here, he finally said, his back still to me. Your email was very professional, I said, my voice dangerously calm. I haven't read the article. I'm not going to. He finally turned, and the man I saw was not the confident reporter. He was pale, his eyes wide and haunted. Ethan, please. This is my job. This is my life. And what was I? I asked, the question tearing out of me, raw and wounded. Was I part of your job too? Was I just research? A new experience to file away? No, he said, the word a choked whisper. No, of course not. Then what was it? I took a step closer. Because you kissed me, Liam. You came into my home, night after night. You slept on my couch. You laid your head in my lap. You held my hand. And you kissed me. And then you disappeared. You ran away and sent me a form letter. So you have to tell me what that was. Because the story you're writing in that article, I gestured vaguely towards the office beyond the glass. It's not the real one. And I think you know that. He collapsed into one of the chairs, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. The entire facade of Liam Carter, star reporter, crumbled into dust right before my eyes. All the anger I had been holding on to, all the righteous fury that had propelled me here, suddenly evaporated, replaced by a wave of aching pity. I freaked out, he mumbled into his hands. I freaked out. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. I woke up on your couch, and the sun was coming up, and you were asleep, and it was the most peaceful I have felt in, maybe my whole life. And it terrified me. He stood up and began to pace the small room, a caged animal. This isn't my life, Ethan. This isn't who I am. I date women. I have a career path. I have a narrative. And none of it includes this. Includes feeling this way about a man. He stopped and looked at me, his expression a tortured mix of fear and longing. I've built my whole identity on a certain kind of story, and you don't fit. What happened between us, it doesn't fit. So you decided to pretend it didn't happen? I asked, my voice softer now. I didn't know what else to do, he said, his voice cracking. I went back to my apartment, and it felt like a stranger's house. I came here, to work, and it felt like a costume. The only place that felt real was your apartment. With you. And I was so scared of what that meant, of what I would have to change, of what I would have to admit to myself. To everyone. So I ran. I ran back to the only story I knew how to write. The one where I'm the reporter, and you're the subject. It was easier. It was safer. He finally stood still, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. The kiss wasn't a mistake, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Running away was the mistake. I'm so sorry, Ethan. I'm so sorry. The confession, when it came, was not a grand declaration. It was a quiet, broken admission of fear. He wasn't a predator who had used me. He was a man just as lost and scared as I had always been. Only he had hidden it better, even from himself. He had built his life like a fortress, and I had inadvertently found a secret, unguarded door. He wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of the truth I represented. The truth of who he might be, outside the neat narrative he had written for his life. In his confession, I didn't find the answers I thought I wanted. I found him, the real him, the man who was just as terrified of the light as I had always been. And in that shared, acknowledged fear, a new, more honest foundation began to form. The aftermath of our confrontation in that sterile conference room was not a sudden, cinematic resolution. It was quiet, tentative, and achingly real. There were no dramatic embraces, no easy promises. There was only a shared, fragile silence, the kind that follows a storm. He had confessed his fear, and I had, by showing up, confessed my refusal to be erased. We were left standing in the rubble of the stories we had told ourselves, blinking in the unfamiliar light of a new, unwritten truth. He walked me to the elevator, the professional buzz of his office a world away. Don't go home, he said, his voice low and urgent. Wait for me. There's a small park a few blocks from here. By the river. I'll meet you there in an hour. I have to do something first. I trusted him. I don't know why, after everything, but I did. The fear in his eyes had been replaced by a resolve I hadn't seen before. I went to the park and sat on a bench facing the gray, choppy water, the city's hum a distant drone. I watched the currents, the way the light hit the surface, and I waited. It was what I was good at. An hour later, he appeared. He wasn't wearing his work jacket, and his hair was wind-tousled. He looked younger, less burdened. He sat down beside me, leaving a careful foot of space between us. I pulled the article, he said, not looking at me, but out at the river. I told my editor the angle was wrong, that I couldn't find a real story. He wasn't happy, but I couldn't write it. Not anymore. It would have been a lie. The relief that washed over me was so profound it left me breathless. It wasn't just about the article. It was about him choosing our truth, our complicated, messy, unwritten story, over his professional safety net. It was the first, solid proof that I hadn't imagined everything. Thank you, I whispered. He finally turned to me, and his smile was a small, hesitant thing, nothing like his usual bright, public-facing grin. This one was real. I'm the one who's sorry, Ethan. For everything. For being a coward. And so, we began again. Not as reporter and subject, but as two people fumbling their way forward. The following weeks were a delicate negotiation of space and trust. The grand, sweeping gestures of our previous ritual were gone. The couch, once our primary territory of intimacy, was temporarily retired. Instead, our new life was built on small, intentional acts of domesticity. He would come over, and we would cook dinner, make movements at careful choreography in my small kitchen. We would talk for hours, but the conversations were different now. He asked me about my childhood, not for an article, but because he wanted to know me. I asked him about his family, his dreams, the things he was afraid of, and he answered honestly, without his usual performative charm. The darkroom became our sanctuary again, but in a new way. He would sit on a stool in the corner, watching me work, and the silence was no longer a space of analysis for me, or a source of professional curiosity for him. It was a shared peace. One evening, as I was gently rocking a tray of developer, he came to stand beside me. I braced myself, half expecting a repeat of the moment that had started it all. But this time, there was no ambiguity. He simply reached out, took my free hand, and held it. His fingers laced with mine, a quiet, solid presence in the amber light. It was a statement, a promise. We stood like that for a long time, watching the image of an empty road emerge from the paper, our hands joined. Two solitary figures finally finding the same path. The first time he stayed the night, properly, was almost a month later. There was no pretext of exhaustion, no accidental falling asleep. We had finished dinner, the plates were cleared, and a comfortable quiet had settled over us. I don't want to go home, he said, his voice soft. It was a simple statement of fact. I looked at him, at the open, vulnerable hope in his eyes, and I knew the time for couches and plausible deniability was over. Then don't, I said. I led him to my bedroom, a space he had never been in. It was simple, sparse, a reflection of me. He looked around, at the stack of photography books on my nightstand, at the single-framed print on the wall, a photo of the ocean at dawn. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights, the same view as from the living room, but somehow more private from here. I came to stand beside him. The symbolic barrier of the bedroom door, a boundary I had so fiercely guarded my whole life, had been crossed. And it didn't feel like an invasion. It felt like a homecoming. Sleeping next to him was a revelation. After weeks of stolen, anxious closeness on the couch, the simple, uncomplicated act of sharing a bed, of feeling the warmth of his body next to mine without pretext or fear, was a profound comfort. There was no dramatic passion, no cinematic climax. It was something better. It was peace. I fell asleep to the steady rhythm of his breathing, my hand resting on his chest, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, my mind was completely, blissfully quiet. There was nothing to analyze, nothing to fear. There was only the solid, reassuring truth of him, here, beside me. A few weeks after that, I had a new exhibition opening. It was a small affair at a local gallery. The series was new, different from the hollow places. It was about the sea, about the meeting of water and land, the constant, shifting boundaries. I had struggled for weeks with the artist's statement, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. One evening, I confessed my frustration to Liam. He just smiled. "Let me help," he said. He sat down with me, not with a reporter's notepad, but with a blank sheet of paper. He didn't write it for me. He talked to me. He asked me questions, the same way he had at the beginning. But this time, His questions were not designed to extract a story, but to help me find my own. He was using his greatest skill, his gift for words, not to define me, but to empower me. Together, we crafted the statement. It was short, honest, and it spoke not of technique, but of the search for a place of belonging. On the opening night, the gallery was crowded. I felt the old, familiar urge to retreat, to find a corner and observe from a distance. But then I felt a warm hand slide into mine. It was Liam. He stood beside me, his presence a quiet anchor in the noisy room. He wasn't there as a reporter or as a secret. He was just there, with me. People came up to congratulate me, their eyes flicking from me to our joined hands. I didn't pull away. Liam didn't flinch. He just smiled his real smile, the one that reached his eyes, and squeezed my hand. Later, when the crowd had thinned, we stood before a large print of a calm sea at dusk, the horizon line a soft, blurry merger of gray water and gray sky. "It's a beautiful story, Ethan," he said, his voice low, for my ears only. I looked from the photograph to his face, illuminated by the gallery lights. I thought about the long, lonely journey that had led me to this moment. I had spent so many years capturing the beauty of empty spaces, of abandoned rooms and desolate landscapes. I had thought that was my story, the story of a man who understood silence. But I was wrong. The silence was only the beginning. It was the blank page. The real story, the one that truly mattered, was about what happens when someone else walks into that silence, not to fill it with noise, but to share it. It's about learning that a home isn't a place you can capture with a camera, but a presence you build with someone else. We had started with a lie, a professional pretext that masked a deeper truth. And now, here we were, living in the beautiful, honest, open space we had learned to create together. The story was no longer his or mine. It was ours, and it was just beginning.